Well, good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Pedro Oliveira from Sydney, Australia. Pedro joined the Brazilian section of the Theosophical Society in 1978 and has worked in several capacities. He served as International Secretary at the International Headquarters between 1992 and 1996. Pedro also served as the Education Coordinator in the Theosophical Society in Australia and was the President of the Indo-Pacific Federation. And he has lectured extensively in Australia, Indo-Pacific region, and other countries as well. He's the author of 3 books: Sri Ram, A Life of Beneficence and Wisdom, CWL Speaks, and Annie Besant in India. His articles have been published in many international journals. Pedro's topic this evening is Mysticism, Bridge to Nowhere. Pedro, it's lovely to have you and see you with us and have you with us again. You're most welcome. Please continue.
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. Good evening, Sushma. Good evening, Sushma's mother. She is probably in Dod Balapur, I suppose. In journalistic parlance, the word mystic sometimes has a negative connotation, as if it was a foggy idea or an abstruse idea or an idea which is not relevant for the day-to-day world. Mystics had to contend with this over the centuries. They had to contend with misunderstanding. But the idea is the idea behind the word is a very interesting one. The word mystic, the word myth, the word mystery, they have a common etymological source in Greece, meion, which means literally to close the eyes and the lips. Now, if you just stay with this idea for a few seconds, what happens when you close the eyes and the lips? You cannot see ordinarily, and therefore you cannot describe what you see. This idea is also very much part of the mystery tradition, not only in Greece, but in other countries as well. For example, in the Eleusinian mysteries, the lesser mysteries, they were basically parades around the temple and around the city. But the greater mysteries, and therefore there are many historical descriptions about these mysteries, but there's not even one description of the greater mysteries in Eleusis, because they were of a mystical nature. And the scholars who studied this, they'd say that they found elements or evidence that the one who presided over the greater mysteries was the goddess herself. And there are some statues and high reliefs about this. So mysticism essentially is an untranslatable experience. I thought my idea could work many years ago. I tried to ask the audience, I'm not going to ask you, but I tried to ask the audience many, many years ago in Australia for them to think, not to report or to give testimony, but just to think how they felt when they fell in love for the first time. And one old gentleman on the first row said, "It was a mess." That was not my intention. My intention is, it's a very special moment in one's life when you really are able to express your feelings at a deep level to someone when you were quite young. And my suspicion was that within that experience, that there is something in the nature of that experience that relates to the word mysticism, because you cannot fully translate that. Very briefly, there are some classic definitions of what mysticism is. Evelyn Underhill, a very important student of mysticism, she wrote a book called Mysticism. She said that mysticism is the art of union with reality. So it's not just a dry discipline, an austere discipline, right? No, it's a form of art. It's the art of consciousness, that which can take you to union with reality. And she also said, it is the expression of the innate tendency of the human spirit towards complete harmony with the transcendental order. So there is an order which we can see in nature, sometimes in society as well. But beyond that order, there is a transcendental order. A very respected physicist who was very close to J. Krishnamurti, they had many conversations together, Dr. David Bohm, wrote a book called Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And he suggested that at the very depths of that implicate order, matter and consciousness are not separate, but they are one. We don't have the time to go too much into these aspects. Let me also mention here a certain element of mysticism poetically explained by Robert Browning. I'm sure many of you have read this poem called Paracelsus. Truth is within ourselves. It takes no rise from outward things, whatever you may believe. There is an inmost center in us all where truth abides in fullness, and around, wall upon wall, the gross flesh hems it in. This perfect, clear perception, which is truth, a baffling and perverting carnal mesh binds it and makes all error. And to know rather consists in opening a way whence the imprisoned splendor may escape, than in effecting the entry for a light supposed to be without. This is a very ancient concept, that imprisoned within us, buried within our personality, our body, our brain, our emotions, our knowledge, our experience, deeply buried within our consciousness, that is that which has been called the eternal, timeless, Brahman, God, if you like. In the wonderful metaphorical teaching of Plato, he basically diagnosed the human condition as a cave. We all live in this cave. He said, in this case, we were born in this cave, chained to the ground. The only thing that we can see are the shadows projected on the wall by passers-by, and there is a source of fire somewhere behind us. So we can see the voices of the passers-by and the shadows, and for us, the only reality is the shadow. This metaphor is so profound and so current that, you see, we consider real every thought and emotion that we have. But there are some wise people who have said they are like these shadows. Truth is much beyond that. we also can consider very briefly some lines from one of the greatest mystical poet of all time, Jalaluddin Rumi. He said, "The affair of religion is only bewilderment." The affair of religion, the business of religion, is only bewilderment. We have lost this capacity. Why? Because within our minds and brains, René Descartes has won. The Cartesian worldview has won. That is us here and the world there. And therefore we dissect the world, we try to explain the world, we try to explain every experience, and we have lost the capacity to bewilder in front of nature and the world. Mr. Jinarajadasa, one of the former presidents of the Theosophical Society, said, "Even a wayside flower throbs with the message of the cosmos." Nobody cares for a wayside flower. People care for their gardens, they spend some money on their garden and they tend to their garden. But he was saying even a little wild flower, a roadside flower, throbs with the message of the cosmos. Why? Because if you stop and look at it without thought, there is order, grace, life, oneness in that little wayside flower. As Rumi also said, and I would like to suggest that if you Google Rumi, you will find 98% of the sayings there, they are not Rumi's saying. Somebody is using his name, many people, to promote themselves. I'm not criticizing them, but it's a fact. This also happens to the Dalai Lama. Many people attribute certain statements to the Dalai Lama, which he never said. Anyhow, he said, the Sufi is the son, S-O-N, or the daughter of time present. The Sufi is the son or the daughter of the time present. Just imagine this for a moment. That consciousness, which is the consciousness of a Sufi, suffers no influence from the past, suffers no pull from the future, no projection from the future, no anticipation of the future. That consciousness is immersed in the present moment. I think that if a sufficient number of people understood this, the industry of self-help would suffer a similar destiny of some banks nowadays. Again, I'm not against the industry of self-help. It's helpful for a number of people. But this is what he said, that a Sufi lives in the present moment. Meister Eckhart was a great mystic, a Dominican who lived in Germany. He used to give fresh sermons every Sunday. He was a real mystic. His fundamental theme was the birth of the Christ in the human soul. By Christ, he meant Christ, not the historical Christ, not the theological Christ, not the institutional Christ, but the Christ, the risen one, the teacher, the healer. And this is what he wrote. There is nothing so unknown to the soul as itself. There is nothing so unknown to the soul as itself. And you can see how practical his statement is. Whatever we say we can know about ourselves it can only happen in the realm of definitions, of descriptions. But who is making these descriptions and these definitions? The personal self. Right? And therefore, self-knowledge becomes elusive. I was in Madras working for the TS in the early 90s when one of the great Shankaracharyas died, Chandrasekhara Swamigal. He was the Shankaracharya of Puri, one of the sites that the historical Shankaracharya inaugurated. He was a very respected man, not only as a yogi, but as a teacher. And one of the things that they published in the newspapers to commemorate his passing was this: self-knowledge is the longest journey to the nearest place. Self-knowledge, it is the longest journey to the nearest place. I know I have mentioned this before, but it warrants repetition. In the pursuit of self-knowledge, we lose ourselves in desire, in pride, in fear, in a sense of loss, in a sense of exaltation, in a sense of self-affirmation, but they are not self-knowledge. Self-knowledge, Atma Jnana, is to understand that everything that is ephemeral, which means everything that begins and ends, is unreal. And therefore, you don't give energy to that which is unreal. You realize that as unreal and you go further, you go deeper. And when self-knowledge is attained, there is also a peace that transcends all understanding. In the ancient Sanskrit language, this peace is called Shantam, which is, it's a boundless peace. It's not an occasional sense of peace. It partakes of the nature of reality. Moving on, one of the great Spanish mystics was Saint John of the Cross. He lived in Spain in the 16th century. He was the spiritual mentor of Santa Teresa of Avila. And he wrote a whole poem called The Dark Night of the Soul. I think many people may respond to that, or they may realize how what he wrote bears resemblance with their own experience. He said, "O night that was my guide, O darkness dearer than the morning's pride, O night that joined the lover to the beloved bride, transfiguring them into each other. The bride is the soul, the beloved is God or the divine." And this is what the seeker discovers, that when he or she discovers their soul, they discover simultaneously the divine. This is also a very important teaching in the Vedanta tradition. When the individual finally realizes that his or her true self is Atma, the fundamental simultaneous discovery is that there is no division, there is no separation between Atma and Brahman. So fundamentally, that's our real identity. Santa Teresa was a very profound mystic, and she wrote something which is profoundly moving. Probably this comes from her work called The Inner Castle. And it gives an idea of how the mystical realization has immediate bearing into the world of relationships, into the world in general. She said, Christ has no body but yours now. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. You can see how this may have inspired generations of selfless workers. I read many, many years ago that in an address by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India, she said that she acknowledged with shame that it was necessary for a Yugoslavian nun to come to India to teach Indians compassion for the lepers in Calcutta. Because some people would pass by them. I'm sure this kind of attitude would happen in other countries. They would pass by the lepers and they would say, that's their karma. I'm not going to do anything about it. The difference between that and Mother Teresa is that she picked them up and she created an entire institution, the Missionaries of Charity, to help them. And you can see that from a certain point of view, there is no difference between a mystical experience and the experience of love in its real sense. I would qualify that by using another Sanskrit word, Swarupa love. That means, Swarupa is a Sanskrit word which means the essential nature of something. As Mr. Jalaluddin said, in the little wayside flower, all the glory, the order of the universe is there, but we don't see it. We go a little bit now to Alexander Pope, a very famous English poet. All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance direction which you can't not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil universal good. Years later, I discovered a passage from Dr. George Arundel, a former president of the TS, when he said in his book that indifference is compassion in the becoming. Hate is love in the becoming. Foolishness is wisdom in the becoming. I know it's probably difficult for us to understand this, but he was convinced that that was the order of things, that the evolutionary stream will eventually help to teach every one of us, including all sentient beings, that there is this higher order of things. His Holiness the Dalai Lama recommends a book whenever he has to give one of his very vast Kala Chakra initiations. He recommends to the participants that they should study the book A Guide to the Way of Life of a Bodhisattva by Shantideva. Shantideva was a student initially at the University of Nalanda in Northeast India. And he was a very quiet student, and therefore the other students used to tease him. It's very common for young students to tease those who are quiet. So when the day of the graduation came, and of course he was concentrating on his spiritual practice, in his sadhana, right? When the day of the graduation came, in an open field, all the students were there together with the professors and teachers, and they were waiting for him, and they were asking if they would come at all. And suddenly they look, and Shantideva was hovering over them through the field and descended exactly on his spot, on his chair. And from that day onwards, they realized that he was not a fool or a quiet person only. He was a Buddhist adept. That's what some scholars suggest. And in this book, The Guide of the Way of Life to the Bodhisattva, Shantideva wrote this magnificent verse. If you want to afford protection to yourself and to others, practice the ancient secret. Exchange self for others. Because self-centeredness is a form of, it is a malady. It's a form of illness. Madame Blavatsky taught the same thing. She said that the essence of Theosophy is altruism. That means a dedication for others. And the Jewish theologian Martin Buber said something very similar. He said, all actual life is encounter. All actual life is meeting. But you need to be prepared for that meeting. Otherwise, you may miss the opportunity, you know. Remember the wayside flower of Mr. Jinaraja Das. It may not be a flower, it may not be an animal, it may be another person. The little book Light on the Path says that our enemy is a mystery to be resolved. The persons with whom we disagree, we think differently, and there could be several levels of disagreement. It is a mystery to be resolved. The Dalai Lama had to escape from Tibet in 1959 under the risk of being caught by the Chinese. His escape was helped by the oracle, the state oracle of Tibet, who gave to his aides the most secure and effective route of escape when the oracle was in a kind of a trance. And that oracle, which belongs to a family, is still in the Ramsala and the Dalai Lama, and he still visits the Dalai Lama. The important point here is that it is very difficult to find a hateful statement from His Holiness the Dalai Lama regarding the Chinese government. And of course, this has caused sometimes some division within the Tibetan movement. There are others who thought that he should be much more tough with the Chinese government and so on. But that is his understanding, and he keeps spreading the keynote of compassion. Martin Buber also said, he was paraphrasing the book of Genesis. You know, in the book of Genesis, it is said, in the beginning, God created the world, and so on and so forth. Martin Buber said, in the beginning is relation. Our universe is a relational universe. We are in it to learn the art of relationships. And finally, yes, I'm here. There is this great mystic from England, from the 18th century, Julian of Norwich, very profound mystic. And her teaching is so current, I would say, so valid for our lives, for society, if we could listen to her. This is what she said. If there is anywhere on earth a lover of God who is always kept safe, I know nothing of it, for it was not shown to me. But this was shown, that in falling and rising again, we are always kept in that same precious love. I don't need to ask anybody if you ever in your life experience a sense of fall or failure, because it's a universal experience. And what is she saying? She said she didn't know anybody who had never failed. It was not shown to her. What showed to her was that in failing and rising again, we're always kept in that same precious love. And this bears witness in many other teachings. One of the Beatitudes talk about those who are persecuted, a blessing to those who are persecuted in Christ's name. In the Buddhist tradition, I visited Sri Lanka a number of times, and I was told that there is the legend of Angulimala. Angulimala means, his name means, he was a bloodthirsty criminal who used to rob people, and every person he robbed, he would cut off a finger. And he made a mala of severed fingers. It's not a pleasant idea, you know. You can Google his name, Angulimala. So the Buddha was there in Sri Lanka, according to the tradition, with 500 arhats. And the tradition says they didn't fly first class. You know, they traveled through the ordinary means. But it was night and his entire camp was asleep. And Angulimala knew that the Buddha was a very special person, and he wanted to rob him of his belongings. And this is the extraordinary happening. The tradition says, the legend says, the moment Angulimala entered the atmosphere or the field of the consciousness of the Buddha, he immediately realized that his lifestyle was wrong. And he became one of the great disciples of the Buddha, Angulimala. The Buddha was asleep. Probably the consciousness of the Buddha was never asleep, but his body was asleep. That's what the legend says. I would like to conclude by saying, and then we can have comments and questions, that one of the great sages, one of the very great sages of the Indian tradition was Sri Ramana Maharshi. I have to make an announcement. I'm sorry. There is a cat here. Sorry. He attained his state of blessedness when he was 14. And somebody later on asked him, how can we help others? I have a theory that every time you ask a question to a wise person, you have to be prepared for self-demolition, because the wise mind does not function within the parameters of our mind. And so the question was to Sri Ramana Maharshi, how can we help others? His answer was, there are no others. Thank you.
Okay, questions. Thank you, Pedro. Fantastic. I'll have some from the lodge and then we'll go to online. Okay, anyone from the lodge? I'm going to leave it to our
So, a mystic is related to God as a Christian.
Did you hear that, Pedro?
Can you please repeat?
So, a mystic is related to God as a Christian.
No, I try to show that there are mystics in different traditions. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, even in science, we have some, like David Bohm, who found, discovered profound dimensions of consciousness.
Okay, so has anyone online got their hand up or anything?
Arun has a question.
Is his microphone on?
No,
Yeah,
Arun,
mine
you
is
have to-
on.
Yes,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've thought about this one, and then that person who asked that question from Wellington about whether this was Christian mysticism, I think you don't have the same problems if it was from the Eastern tradition, because in the Eastern tradition it's more about Advaita and Vaita, you know, the dualism and non-dualism. And I think in this regard, we might be looking at in the Indian perspective, the non-dualism tradition, and that might start from Shankaracharya, Ramana Maharshi, all the way to Krishnamurti, even today, Rupert Spira, Muji, so on. And so I think if you use the Indian definition, I find it a little bit more convincing. Whereas if you study Meister Eckhart, he's very careful with his words. He talks about Grund. You know, this is a German word for ground of being. And he says the ground of my being is the same as the ground of God's being. But he doesn't go as far as saying I and God are one. That, on the other hand, you might find in someone like Mansukh al-Hajjaj, you know, in the Persian, the Islamic tradition. But what happened with him was they essentially crucified him. And Meister Eckhart was accused of blasphemy, but he died before his case was heard. But if you study Meister Eckhart, you still don't get the same nuances as you do with, say, Ramana Maharshi and so on, of I and ultimate reality are one and the same.
Well, I'm not an advocate of Meister Eckhart, but this I can say because I studied his sermons. He said that there is in the human soul a profound abyss in which there is no image, no will, no memory, no emotions. He said, this abyss is so vast and endless that if God himself would look into it, he would cease to be God. And then he was prosecuted by the Inquisition. Yep. So one of the theologians said he was talking about God beyond God. Is it that means there is the God that can be described by the theologians.
Yeah.
And in the Mahatma letters, they say that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But they were prepared to accept the God of Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, which was very similar to what Meister Eckhart said. In any case, probably you are very much more familiar with the Eastern tradition.
Yes.
I found some passage. For example, he was talking about prayer one Sunday morning. He said, if you really pray, you don't exist. Only God exists. Anyhow.
Okay. Edward.
Yes, good evening, and thank you so much for an excellent presentation. My question to you is, you've made a lot of different references to different people, and I have tried to make note of them, but I would ask you, is there a place where you may have these listed, the different people's names and perhaps their citations, their books or their poems? I know, for example, you mentioned Robert Browning, and that perhaps is something easily to locate, but some of the other people that you have mentioned, I would like to get the citations for those if that's possible, and especially the spelling. Thank you.
Yes, I cannot do it now, but I can email the Word file to Simon.
Yeah, that's fine. I can get it to you, Edward.
At no cost.
Thanks, Pedro. Great.
Perfect. Thank you. No cost is great.
Anyone else got any kind of comments, questions, concerns? I mean, anyone?
Anyone else? Okay, sure.
Yeah, for myself, I was thinking, you know, you get challenged every day. So, you know, I think St. Paul said, I die daily. So every moment you're challenged, you've got, what you say about life as a relationship, Pedro, the people you meet, you know, push your button, so to speak, but ultimately you've got to get to a space where there's no buttons to push, there's no one there. And that's the challenge of being an incarnation, really, because we're all in relationship. Krishnamurti talked about relationship, you know, so I think it was Annie Besson who said, if you want to learn brother, we'll get on a committee. You know, so we're here to actually engage and make the most of any situation. And Sish and I were having a look at Catherine Mansfield, who died, you know, in France with Gurdjieff. And she wrote a letter to her husband the last days, weeks of her life. And she talked about two streams. 95% of the world are in one stream, perpetuating the ego, whereas the 5% of the mass of the world are in another stream, where she described as a process of alchemy, going from one stream to the other, from the 95% stream to the 5% stream, where there is no ego, there's no self, there's just the one. So I found that quite interesting. She said, whatever experience you have in life, you can turn it into an alchemical process by going from one stream to the other. So, you know, that's our challenge.
Thank you, Simon. I've had some feedback from online. Whoever would like to speak in the lodge will have to face the mic and then speak. So if anyone has any questions from the lodge or comments.
No.
The
Okay.
expression face the mic can be very threatening.
Well, we can't hear if you're face away from it. So yeah. Anyone else online? Anyone has any comments?
By the way, it's nice to see you all online. Barbie,
Yeah.
Steve from the Chatham Islands.
Okay, if does anyone else have any questions?
I think
Arun has.
Orlando had a question, didn't she?
Orlando, did you want to say anything?
Hello. Yes, actually, you must have been a bit intuitive because I was thinking of a question but hadn't raised my hand. So thank you very much, Pedro. Really enjoyed that. And it's just, maybe it's just a semantics question, but is there a relationship or a need to understand esoteric versus mystic or mysticism? Is there a difference? Are they just our words for something that's very similar?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Throughout her writings, Madame Blavatsky emphasized the occult path or the occult teachings, and she made it clear that for a person to develop along the occult path, a great deal of will is necessary, but that will has to be preceded by a sense of altruism, because she said the will alone may create the individual, may create a kind of a warped individual, because if he or she allows their sense of self-importance to grow, then there is a problem. But that was her emphasis. And surprisingly, and almost paradoxically, according to some, her very last book was a book on mysticism, The Voice of the
Voice
Silence.
of the Silence, yeah.
And this book goes very deep into the mystical path. It talks about the ladder of mystical sounds. But in one passage, it says that the mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. And therefore, we need the breezes of the soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. She's suggesting that the individual who is in search of self-knowledge needs to realize that the mind tends to accumulate experiences without understanding them. And another Indian author from the mid 20th century, Rohit Mehta, he said, if an experience which ends in time, if that experience doesn't end psychologically, the moment it ends in time, this gap will generate psychological memory and therefore disturbances in us. So it's essentially the same teaching. He also was a very deep student of the Voice of the Silence. So I would say briefly that the esoteric part, so to speak, has to do with self-development based on altruism, but the mystic path, it involves development as well, but the emphasis is on what Madame Blavatsky called in The Voice of the Silence, the heart doctrine, instead of the I doctrine. It is so easy, if you remain in the field of knowledge, it's so easy for that field of knowledge to give you the impression that you already know. Now, The Voice of the Silence says, the really important things can only be known at the heart level. She also equates the heart level with bodhi or wisdom.
Okay. All right. It's nearly 8 o'clock. Any other comments, questions for Pedro?
Well, I would like to thank again Wellington Lodge for this invitation. People there must be getting tired of me, Simon.
No.
If you invite me again, I will try to change my appearance.
You look just as good as ever.
Yeah, no, great. It's great to have you, Pedro. And you can see a little bit of the building here, the lodge.
Yes.
England have been here before, so it's great that we can leverage off what we did last year.
Yes.
Continue on with our hybrid approach, so which is really, really good. Again, thanks from the committee, thanks from the members for starting us off in 2023.